I'm going to be looking at the factions primarily from the perspective of skirmish and team deathmatch, so obviously looking at multiplayer balance and things like that, going through the different ones and their strengths and weaknesses, and talk about a little bit about improvements, but primarily about what's strong and weak now, rating them by the tiers of different troop types. So I'm going to go through infantry, range, and cavalry for each faction. I'm going to give each of those three categories a rating, and then the faction and overall rating, and then by the end I'll have a complete tier list, which will give you some more detail about what aspects are strong, so that if you're playing TDM or skirmish, you know what you should be focusing on as your faction and what the weaknesses are of the enemy faction. The first faction I'm going to look at is Britannia, and this faction I've given a tier 1 rating to their faction overall, and a tier 1 rating to their infantry, a tier 1 rating to their archers, and a tier 3 rating to their cavalry. So going through the infantry first, the main reason for this is the Wildling and the Oathbound. These two units are incredibly good. The Oathbound costing 150 is the heavy infantry unit of the faction, with 40 armor, coming with the javelins if you get the perk, which I very much recommend. They're incredibly powerful, and a good sword that comes with it as well. They're one of the best heavy armor units in the game, particularly if you get the javelins, because you can dish out some very high damage at range and then be tanky in melee. The Wildling is much cheaper, so it's not necessarily good to take at the start when you're on base gold, but once you've got your money up and you can guarantee yourself several lives as Wildling, they're very, very good as well. The axe is not quite as good as the sword, even though it has more damage because you have to hit with the head of the axe itself. But if you get additional javelins, you can be running around with 11, which is a huge amount. There's not much point playing with the improved armor perk, I don't think, because in that case you might as well just be playing Oathbound. But if you're getting extra lives out of it, then there's some argument for using the improved armor perk. And the sword I don't think is really worth getting at all. It has to be one of those two. The weaker units, like the Savage, I mean, it's got some potential, I guess. Not really, you're just going to get shot down at range. You're not fast enough, even though it's one of the fastest units, you're not fast enough to dodge arrows. And the Clan Warrior is very cheap, and it's actually one of the best 100 cost units in the game if you get the shield with it. The melee weapon's quite weak, but obviously it's decent against armor. They're quick, they've got alright armor for 100 cost, so they're not bad. So basically they've got 3 quality infantry units and 2 incredibly good. The Wildling and the Oathbound are very, very good, so they're definitely deserving of tier 1 there. The Ranger has some of the highest armor for a low cost troop, and it can be upgraded even further if you want. It's also got access to a pretty powerful bow for its cost. I wouldn't recommend the 200 axe perk at all, but either of these are fairly viable, to be honest, with its cost. And the Fian, of course, arguably the best range unit in the game, possibly the Sharpshooter in some contention for that. But I mean, this unit, all 3 of these perks are very good. If you're getting improved armor, you're going up to the level of top tier infantry armor. If you get the longbow, you're shooting with the damage of a light crossbow. If you get the extra arrows, you're going to be able to keep shooting for ages with a very powerful bow. So the Fian, incredibly strong, and definitely makes this a tier 1 ranged. The cavalry is pretty mediocre. It's not terrible. This is the thing, it's not awful, because its lance is actually fairly long compared to some of the default ones that other factions have. It comes with a good shield by default. The horse, I'm not sure, I think it's fairly mediocre, to be honest. I've not played this unit much myself because there's so many better options in infantry and range. But if you improve it, the improved armor I wouldn't say is worth it too much. I think getting either javelins as these, which are high damage and you get 6 of them, you can ride around and throw them in backs, or the heavy horse, so you're a bit tankier in ground engagements, is better. But Britannia as a whole, they're a very mobile faction. They've got the highest average movement speed of any faction. They've got some of the best melee units, some of the best ranged units, and the absence of strong cavalry doesn't matter too much because they're so mobile with the javelins. They can already do the job of kiting and dealing heavy range damage. And if enemy heavy cavalry comes at them, this is the crucial thing, with the javelins and with the strong bows, they can take out enemy cavalry very quickly. and that means that the fact they don't have any doesn't really matter. Empire is an interesting faction for several reasons, but overall I've given it a tier 2 rating. The infantry's got tier 2, the archer's got tier 2, and the cavalry's got tier 2. Kind of a jack of all trades faction. I wouldn't say they have the best unit in any of these categories, but I would say they've got very strong units in all of them, and that's why they're a pretty good faction overall. So if we start going through the troops, the recruit looks pretty bad on the surface. Its armor is not fantastic, the shield is pretty weak, not a great sword either, although the thrust damage is quite high. But the main thing that gives it a bit of power is these javelins, because you're a 100 cost unit and you're coming with some javelins, and you can get a decent amount of them if you get the perk as well. You come with 10, so it more than doubles the amount you get by default. And you can actually take out high cost units fairly easily with those javelins. Getting the better shield perk I don't think is worth it. The spear is possibly worth it if the other team is running a lot of cavalry, because then you're fairly mobile, you've got javelins, spear and a sword, and so you're kind of playing support. The Manavlion infantry is not particularly viable at all, because it's pretty easy to shoot down, but I suppose there's some fun to be had with it. And the Legionary is one of the better heavy armor troops in the game. The Pila is not viable at all, do not take that. I see too many people taking it. Do not do that, it's not good, you only get 2 of them. The heavy mace is good if you're against other heavy infantry. It's actually very, very good for taking down their armor. And the improved armor makes you the tankiest unit in the game with 50 body armor, no one has higher. Archer Militia comes with 3 base armor, which is pretty mediocre. It's not a brilliant unit, it's pretty low tier archer, but it does only cost 110, but it's not great. But the Palatine Guard is very good, and this is one of the better archer units, probably the best archer unit after the Fian. And that's in part because you can choose from 3 different bows. If you take the Imperial Polearm, which I wouldn't recommend, you get a recurve bow, you can get the superior Imperial bow, or you can get the longbow. I'd say either of these 2 bows are viable. If you take the fast bow, it's quite easy to run out of your arrows because you only come with 31. So you can find yourself shooting all your shots and having nothing left quite quickly. That's why I tend to prefer the longbow. Stat-wise, the fast bow is better, definitely. But you'll run out of arrows too quickly, I think, with this bow. So I think it's better to use the longbow because then you're guaranteed you'll have enough shots. As far as the cavalry goes, the Corsa is, I mean, it's quite expensive for what you get is the problem. Its default lance is fairly long, but I think it's not long enough. I think you kind of have to get the lance perk or javelins if you so choose, but I think the lance perk is the best. It's got quite a quick and tanky horse, the Corsa of course, but it's an alright unit. It comes with good armor. It's fairly good for its cost, but it's not brilliant for 114. The Cataract's a very good cav unit, but it doesn't come with a shield. You can't get one via the perk, and that means that you're going to be vulnerable against... If you're playing against Britannia, for instance, taking Cataract is suicide because you're going to get jabbed, you're going to get shot, you're going to die very quickly. But this is a very tanky cavalry unit if you can, you know, get it into the situations where you don't just get pelted down by javelins. This comes with a tanky horse by default, which you can upgrade into a war courser, which is probably the best horse in the game. The heavy contos is extremely long, and the default sword that it comes with is very long and powerful too. Hunting bow is an interesting choice. I've actually never played this with a hunting bow. I've seen some people do it, but the issue is you're kind of slow, so it makes you quite an easy target for enemy archers. But it's a good unit overall anyway, and it doesn't cost that much more than the Corsa to get, in terms of how many lives you'd actually be able to maximise. So overall, the Empire has good units in every single category, but not the best units in any. So I think that earns it an overall tier 2 rating. Lancia are a difficult one to rate because I've seen them perform quite inconsistently in multiplayer. But overall I've given them a tier 2 rating. Infantry tier 2, Archery tier 1, Cavalry tier 1. And the reason I think it's quite interesting, and how they're kind of inconsistent is because it depends on how well people utilize what they actually have at their disposal. So the peasant levy is actually very good if you take the pitchfork. This thing does a lot of thrust damage and it's very long. It can do quite a lot against cavalry and heavy armored units, and you get lots of lives out of it. If you take the shield, it's tempting, but if you take the shield, you're using a sickle, and you're basically just kind of a meat shield at that point. You can't do that much with a sickle and a kite shield. But if you not confident in your blocking, I guess you can't really take the pitchfork. The Volgier is alright. In TDM he's very good, but against good archers you're just going to get shot down. The All-Pike is too long to use against enemy infantry, they can face-hug you and you can't use it. But the Greatsword is very powerful, and the improved armor on the Volge is alright, I've not used it too much. If ever I play this, I always take the Greatsword. The Sergeant is okay. That's all I can say. He's probably the worst heavy armor infantry unit of all of them. There's definitely better ones around, but he does come with a spear by default. No, sorry, that's on the... Sorry, the Legionary comes with a spear by default. You have to buy his on a perk. But his perks are not great. The Bastard Sword's not brilliant because you have to put your shield away and it makes you quite vulnerable to use it two-handed. The throwing axes are okay. They don't travel very far though, so you have to throw them from very close. And the spear is alright. It's not a particularly long spear, but it's okay. So he's a fairly average unit. He's got 41 armor, so a bit more than Oathbound, but a bit more than base Legionary too, but not as much as the improved armor Legionary. So I think the infantry overall gets a tier 2 because Peasant Levy's got some potential for anti-armor, the Sergeant's an okay heavy unit, and the Volgier is okay too. As far as range goes, the Arbalist is quite cheap compared to some of them. He doesn't come with a lot of armor if you don't improve it. The heavy crossbow is probably the better choice to use as the Arbalist, because then you can deal a lot of damage against heavy units. Additional bolts is probably not advisable because you're probably not going to shoot 24 shots with your crossbow regardless because of the slow reload. So either improved armor or heavier crossbow. I recommend heavier crossbow. That's 15 more damage and more accuracy. You can shred armored targets with that. The Sharpshooter. Now I said before the Fian and the Palatine Guard are possibly the best archer units, but the Sharpshooter is in contest for the best ranged unit because of the Arbalest. Essentially 95 damage at range. You can one-shot most things actually with a headshot, even heavy armored targets, and you can body shot down peasants and things very, very quickly. By default it comes with this incredibly good shield, one of the best shields in the game, and you come with a very good sword too. 67 swing damage, that's a very, very good sword. That's comparable to the sort of thing that the infantry have, although it's a bit shorter. Either the improved armor or the Arbalest I would recommend Arbalest just because of how powerful you are with that shot, but the improved armor does bring the overall armor rating up a bit to put it sort of on par with above mid-tier infantry actually. So the Sharpshooter is incredibly good, but the reason why Land is somewhat inconsistent is because not everyone hits their shots. If you're a bad aim and you're not hitting shots, you're kind of, you take yourself out of the fight. The good thing about the Sharpshooter is if you're a bad aim, take the improved armor perk and you're a hybrid infantry crossbowman, and then you can sort of go in and out and do both roles at once. They're quite expensive, but if you win a round or if you get a good number of kills and you increase your gold amount and you can get 2 lives of these, I have to recommend everyone do that 100% of the time because you're so good with 2 of these lives. So the ranged I'm giving a tier 1 to essentially just because of this unit. The Cavalry I've given tier 1 and that's essentially because of the Knight, but the Vanguard is okay, but very much okay because the spear that they start with is very short. It's as long as the spear that the infantry use. It's the same one actually. So you're going to be outmatched against all enemy cavalry using that. So you essentially have to take the lance perk or you're going to die because your spear's not long enough. With the improved armor it actually becomes quite tanky, that would be interesting. The Warhorse would be interesting too, but you don't have much choice other than the lance, otherwise you're going to be dying to enemy cavalry. The Hunter's alright, it's got decent armor, There are definitely horses with less than that, but it's just a fairly average horse. Now the knight is very, 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 very good no matter what, because it comes with a heavily armored horse by default, a charger. Comes with a good lance by default, the one that the vanguard have to get through their perk, and you can increase it to be even longer if you so choose. Honestly, I think either of these first two perks are viable. The heavy lance, if you're going to be, wanting to outrange enemy cavalry or be a bit more cautious around enemy infantry and ranged units. But if you get the improved armor, you're as tanky as the improved armor Legionary from the Empire. This unit though is very, very expensive, so really you need to be in a situation where you can afford 2 lives of these before you can really exploit it. But once you're at that point, it's a big threat to everyone. So overall, Landia, I've given a tier 2 to, because they're a bit more difficult to use. You kind of need to build up your points a bit to get the knight lives and the sharpshooter lives, but they've got decent units to make up for that in the meantime, whilst you work up to be able to fully exploit their best units. Sturgia is a faction I'm kind of disappointed with, to be honest, because they're obviously meant to be the equivalent of Nords were in Warband, and Nords are my favourite faction, but Sturgia is nowhere near as good as Nords in terms of their infantry quality, and overall I've had to give them a tier 3 rating. Primarily just because of how poorly they perform in things like skirmish and TDM. They're not great. Obviously they do better in skirmish, in TDM, because people use the 2-hand axe and just run around killing everyone with that, but in skirmish they don't do great at all. I've given the infantry tier 2, the archers tier 3, and the cavalry tier 2. So people see the Huskar on this, and so they might be a bit confused by tier 2, when this is a very, very good infantry unit. But the reasoning for that is that the Huskar itself is not, in my opinion, the best infantry unit in the game. The Oathbound is. This is partly because the heavy axe, even though it's got a huge one-handed damage, you have to hit very accurately with the head of it to actually be able to deal any good damage. And the fact that it's so long can actually make it more difficult to damage enemy infantry with the head of the axe, because they get in your face and you need to back off to hit them properly. The throwing axes are alright, they're not great, they're not good at long ranges, and the improved armor, it doesn't even make them the tankiest unit, and their sword is okay that goes with that. They do come with a good shield and spear by default, which increases their power quite a lot, but I don't think it's enough to make them the best unit in the game, best infantry unit. So they're a very high tier infantry unit, but not the best, and it all goes downhill from there. The warrior, like, you have to say, in terms of its armor and its speed, it's one of the better 100 cost infantry units in the game, but it's mainly let down by its weapons, and the Northern Woodsplitter axe is the worst axe in the game, I'm pretty sure. 57 swing damage with an axe is appalling, because you have to hit with this tiny head to actually deal the full damage. The Pascal Axe, for instance, got 94 on it. This is a very, very, very weak axe. You're going to do almost no damage, despite the fact you've got a good amount of armor for a low cost unit. So that would lead you to believe you need to take the sword, but then the short sword, it's short, people can outrange you, and it doesn't deal that much damage either, and it's not much faster than regular swords either. So you're kind of, there's not a good weapon choice for this class. The short spear is okay. Some shorter spears tend to be better for infantry versus infantry if you're in 1v1, because you can actually use them against the guy in front of you, but they're not as good for team fighting. So really I think you have to take the sword or the short spear. Probably the sword, because the axe is so awful. The brigand is worthless. That's the only way of putting it. It's just a shame, because it would be quite nice if they had a skirmishing class, but they don't come with very much armor. They've got the awful axe, they've got a tiny shield which is easy to shoot their feet with, and actually to shoot their body with. It doesn't even cover the width of their body. And these javelins aren't great either, and you don't get that many of them, so it's essentially a waste of time to even bother with brigand. And then this heavy axeman obviously is very useful in TDM, because you're very quick, you've got a big axe, you can run around and just farm people that can't block, especially if you get the long axe, but again, you have no shield. If you're against good archers, you're gonna die. So the infantry overall gets tier 2. The ranged power, the hunter is quite weak. He's not the weakest for this cost archer-wise actually, because he comes with 6 armor by default and you can upgrade that, which it's not an awful idea to do. He also gets a decent axe, a much better axe than the warrior and the brigand. If you compare those stats, it's much better. Which is kind of confusing that this arch unit would get the better axe, but that's how it is. And he's alright if you take the short bow, but again, this is the only option you have. There's no good archer, you don't get a shield, you just have this one cheap alright unit. So I give them the archery a tier 3. The cavalry gets tier 2 because it's actually very good and very good at supporting the melee fight. The raider comes in one of the faster horses, but it's not very tanky, it dies quite quickly. He also gets a pretty long spear by default, 190, same length that the Valandian Vanguard gets if he gets his perk, so you get that just for free. He also gets quite a long axe, which is useful on horseback, but really you kind of need to take the shield because you're going to get dismounted, essentially. This horse goes down quite quickly. You're going to get dismounted and you're going to need the shield to help you fight in melee. Javelins is okay if you're going to sort of kite around and throw, but again, if you're against a faction like Britannia, you need a shield or you're dead. So the javelins wouldn't work with that. This one, so I'm going to say Drazina because I don't know how to pronounce Drazinic, I guess, is okay. It's not great for its cost, but it's okay. I've seen people use it with the bow. I don't think that's a great idea, because again, you're a pretty slow target. You're going to get shot, you're going to die. Getting this with barding is probably the best idea, because then you've got a tanky horse, and you can survive a lot of punishment. I'm not sure the longer lance is a good idea, but it's definitely viable. So either of those two I'd say are quite good here. But primarily the job of cavalry, with this faction at least, is going to be to support the Huskar infantry. So as long as you sort of adapt them for that purpose, you're going to be fine. So cavalry tier 2 and overall the faction is a tier 3, and it's difficult to say that when they've got good cavalry and a good infantry unit, but the fact is that other infantry units are not good enough for me to give this a tier 1 infantry as a faction overall. They're just not good enough for it. And if I look at their performance in skirmish, Sturgia get destroyed by a lot of other factions. They don't do well against them. And the only way I can conclude that is that these 3 units, Warrior, Brigand and Hunter, aren't good enough. And it means that once people run out of Huskar lives, there's nothing else for them to fall back on. There's nothing else that's viable. Essentially, if you play as these guys, you play Huskar and you play Raider, and that's the best way to do it. Unless, of course, you're in TDM, then you just play this guy with the long axe. But for skirmish, that's mainly what you're going to want. Fusée are a pretty simple faction for me to rate. Everything's pretty straightforward here. Infantry tier 3, archers tier 2, cavalry tier 2, and a tier 2 overall, kind of a cautious overall tier 2. But the infantry tier 3, the rabble is fairly good for its cost. And if you get the shield and the mace, you can actually take out armoured units with some efficiency, but it's not brilliant. And the spear infantry is very overpriced for what you get. Even if you tank him up and you only get one of these throwing spears, and if you throw it, then if you throw it, you've lost your spear. So it's not a very good idea to throw it. So it's not a great infantry unit, so tier 3 overall there. As far as the archers goes, the step bow is okay actually as a unit. It doesn't come with a lot of armor, but the bow's alright and it's cheap. And you can get it to a decent armor level, but probably want to go with the short bow. And the Khan's Guard is a very that's a lot of varies. Good infantry unit. Because I say infantry unit because you play it as an infantry ranged hybrid when you get the shield. It's got a lot of armor, it's got a good sword, it's got a good shield if you get the perk. You can play in melee and at range with this guy. He's expensive, obviously, because he's got that ability, but You can also get this very good bow to go with it if you prefer, if you just want to stay at range, but I recommend the shield because then you're very good in melee and at ranged, and that's the best way to play the Khan's Guard as this sort of hybrid, because if you play it as an infantry class, it's better than the spear infantry, but at the same time, you've got a pretty good bow. So it's a very adaptable unit, but only a tier 2 overall because this has such a high cost for what you get. Cavalry, I'm going to count the Horse Archer in as well, and I've given that a tier 2 overall. The Nomad is quite good, comes with a very long lance to start with, and you can get a shield with that, and then you're going to be very good at Cav v Cav because of that long lance. The horse isn't brilliant, it's got high maneuverability, but it's slow and not very tanky at all. Actually, that's a very weak horse. You can get a bow with it as well and try and kite and shoot, but I don't think that's a great idea because you're a pretty easy target and you're fairly weak. And you can get a very quick horse if you get the Tarpan, but I don't think that's worth it. I think getting a shield is best on this and just focus on enemy cavalry. The Lancer is very expensive and not that tanky if you don't improve his armor either, but the Glaive is still OP if you use this thing with two-hander on your horseback. The most damage I've ever dealt with this, I think, was 208 cut damage to one target, and obviously everyone's got about 100 health, so in one swing I did enough damage to kill 2 people. You know, if you ride by full speed and hit someone in the head with this, you're gonna one-hit them. And if it's something like, if it's a tanky infantry unit, it might not be a one-hit, but it's gonna be 2-hit guaranteed if you're going quickly. So this is very powerful, but it does make you vulnerable if you use this with two-handed, because you haven't got your shield out. Improved armor is alright with this too, because you know, then you're just a sort of a fairly tanky cavalry unit, but you're going to be outmatched by things like the knight, because you don't have as long a lance, you don't have as much armor, and your tanky horse isn't as good as their tanky horse. But it has some potential. It's an alright high tier unit. The mounted archer, it's a difficult one to call because the horse is weak. It's had to be downgraded because this unit was kiting too much. You can kite, but you don't have that many arrows, so you need to hit them. If you get the additional arrows perk, you've got a lot and you'll be able to kite forever. Well, obviously not actually forever, but if you take this, you're kind of vulnerable to enemy ranged fire. Again, if you're against something like Britannia, you're dead, so you kind of need the shield for that. I don't think it's worth getting the better horse, but if you're against something like Sturgia, where they've got very, very limited ranged power, and you take additional arrows with this, you're going to be able to kite for a long time, and you're going to be very powerful. But otherwise I'd recommend the shield. But it's an okay unit overall for its cost. Some potential, I guess, if you're playing an organized thing where you've got all of 6 people that are all communicating, you could try running 6 mounted archers and just sort of kite together and sort of focus down single targets with like covering them completely. I can't wait, now that I've suggested that, to play against that in matchmaking, but that's one way of doing it. So overall, I think they're a tier 2 faction. I say that kind of cautiously. Maybe they're tier 3. They're definitely on the lower end of tier 2 because of the cost of units like the Lancer and the absence of strong infantry. But if you fill that role with the Khan's Guard, then it's a very good faction. Asarai are one of the weak factions in the game, for sure. I give them the infantry tier 2, the archers tier 2, the cavalry tier 3, and their overall rating of tier 3. And the infantry is tier 2 because of the tribal warrior. Now this is the best value troop infantry unit in the game. 100 cost, comes with by default just the sword and a fairly weak shield, but if you take the mace you're going to be able to deal with heavy armored targets very quickly, and obviously you're going to get 3 lives out of this right from the start because it's got 100 cost. And the spear is not bad either. It's not particularly long, but it's good against enemy infantry. I don't think it's worth getting the longer shield, to be honest. I think you probably just want to take the mace and focus on armored targets, or the spear and support against cavalry. The skirmisher is weak because, well, for several reasons, it's not that quick, hasn't got that much armor. but the shield's got good coverage and these javelins are okay. And if you upgrade them to Jareeds, you get 8 of them, and these are a lot better. But it's not a fantastic unit. You're better off taking the Tribal Warrior. And the Guard, again, no shield, you're gonna die to enemy range, but I guess it has some use in TDM. If you just run around with a big bardiche, that's kind of fun to do. In terms of their ranged, the Archer is right. It comes with 3 armor by default. We've seen plenty others of the same kind of level. I don't think it's worth getting extra arrows because you're pretty weak. You're probably going to die before you shoot 44 arrows. Probably best getting the short bow and just trying to deal some quick damage if you play this. The Veteran is a very good range unit because, again, just like the Khan's Guard, you can play it as a hybrid infantry unit because it's got good armor and you can get a good shield with it. And you've got a good sword and a very good bow actually that comes with it even if you get the shield. Although you can give yourself a composite bow, which is one of the higher tier bows. But I'd probably recommend getting the shield with this and playing hybrid infantry ranged. I think that deserves an overall tier 2 because the Veteran is a great unit overall, and the Archer's okay. The Cavalry I've given a tier 3 to because they've got these kind of quick horses but also very weak horses. Without much maneuverability, and they're not particularly tanky guys either. Camel's kind of weak because it's so slow, even though it has the most health and maneuverability. They do come with javelins by default, Jareeds, sorry, even, which are the ones you have to pay for as skirmisher. So they've got some ability when they're kiting and things, but I don't think it's a particularly viable unit. You put yourself in a lot of danger by taking this to enemy cavalry for one, because your lance isn't particularly long. It's longer than some cavalry get, but it's not going to outdo heavy cavalry or better units like Raider. And your horse is going to go down quickly too. The Mamluk is probably the worst heavy cavalry unit. It's got the lowest cost of heavy cavalry units, but it's not brilliant. Its default lance, bamboo spear even, is not great. It's not that long. This lance is good though, which I'd recommend taking probably if you want to play it, or if you're wanting to be a more tanky unit, take barding. But I don't know if that's worth it because you're going to be outdone by enemy heavy cavalry regardless if you take this, because your spear is not very long and your horse isn't as good as theirs. So probably lance is the viable take as Mamluk. But overall that's a tier 3 because they're just outdone by the other factions. That's it. These units are not as good as the equivalents in other factions, so it's a tier 3, and that's how simple it is. So Aserai has some potential, but all of their units, they have no one with very heavy armor. The highest you get up to is 32, I'm pretty sure, yeah. So you're going to be outdone by tanky factions. You have to focus on anti-armor weaponry. Which you can do with the Tribal Warrior if you take the mace and things. You can focus on that to some extent, but ultimately you're just a weaker faction. So it's a tier 3 overall. So for the final list, I've got tier 1 with Britannia. Definitely the best overall, strong in infantry and ranged. I've got Empire in tier 2, Crusade in tier 2, and Valandia in tier 2. All 3 of those are okay at everything. Crusade, you might say, is weak on infantry. Empire and Valandia, though, are pretty solid across the board, with Valandia having the Sharpshooter, which is really good on ranged, and Empire just being sort of a jack-of-all-trades faction. Crusade, the weakest of those 3, definitely for sure. I almost put them in tier 3, but I think the versatility of the Khan's Guard and the Nomad kind of makes them a tier 2. And then tier 3 is Aserai and Sturgia. Aserai for obvious reasons. They've got weak armor on all of their units. They've got the best budget, low-cost infantry, but I don't think that makes up for the deficits in terms of their cavalry just being outclassed by others, and the Veteran being the only sort of high high armor infantry unit, ground unit rather, that they have. And then Sturgis tier 3 is a difficult one to call because the Huskarl's good and the Raider's good, but those are really the only two units they've got that are worth their money. Everything else is kind of mediocre. Their low-cost infantry don't have good weapons, even though they've got good armor. And their expensive cavalry is also outdone by other expensive cavalry for its cost. And their ranged unit is just kind of worthless, to be frank. You have no shield, you're going to die to probably a stray cavalry is just going to come and kill you. So that's my list overall, based on the current version of the beta. Hopefully this gives some people some ideas on what they want to take as certain factions and what they want to look out for when they're playing against certain ones.